Welcome to True Crime Stories for English Learners, where real-life mysteries meet clear and simple English. The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff. The phone call came on December 10, 2008. Mark Madoff was calling his lawyer, Martin Flumenbaum, and his voice was shaking. "My father has just told me and my brother that his investment business is a fraud," Mark said. "He said it's all been one big lie. He said he's broke. Everything is gone." The lawyer was stunned. Bernie Madoff was one of the most respected figures on Wall Street. He had been in business for nearly 50 years. He was chairman of NASDAQ. He managed billions of dollars for wealthy individuals, charities, and institutions. He was known for steady, reliable returns year after year. How could it all be a fraud? But it was. For decades, Bernie Madoff had been running the largest Ponzi scheme in history. He hadn't actually invested anyone's money. He had simply taken new investors' money to pay fake returns to earlier investors. It was an elaborate lie that had fooled thousands of sophisticated investors, major banks, and government regulators. And now, with the 2008 financial crisis making it impossible to find new money, the whole scheme was collapsing. When the full scope of the fraud was revealed, the numbers were staggering. $65 billion had vanished. Entire families were financially destroyed. Charities shut down. Retirees lost everything. Some victims committed suicide. And Bernie Madoff, the respected Wall Street legend, was exposed as one of the greatest financial criminals in history. This is the story of how one man built an empire on lies, how he fooled everyone for decades, and how his fraud finally came crashing down, destroying thousands of lives in the process. The Rise of Bernie Madoff. Bernard Lawrence Madoff was born on April 29, 1938, in Queens, New York. His parents were Jewish immigrants who had achieved modest success. His father worked in various businesses, and his mother was a homemaker. The family wasn't wealthy, but they were comfortable, part of New York's middle class. Bernie was intelligent and ambitious from a young age. He attended Far Rockaway High School, where he was a member of the swim team and showed an early interest in finance. After high school, Bernie attended the University of Alabama for 1 year before transferring to Hofstra College, where he graduated in 1960 with a degree in political science. In 1959, while still in college, Bernie married his high school sweetheart, Ruth Alpern. Ruth came from a similar background, middle-class Jewish family from Queens. Her father was an accountant, which would later become significant. Bernie and Ruth seemed like the perfect couple, ambitious, attractive, and determined to succeed. After graduation, Bernie briefly attended Brooklyn Law School, but dropped out after 1 year. He had bigger plans. In 1960, using $5,000 he had saved from working as a lifeguard and sprinkler installer, plus a $50,000 loan from his father-in-law, Bernie started his own investment firm, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC. Bernie's firm started small, essentially as a market maker, buying and selling stocks on behalf of clients, making money on the difference between the buying and selling prices. In the early days, Bernie worked hard to build his business. He cold-called potential clients, worked long hours, and gradually built a reputation as a reliable, innovative broker. During the 1960s and 1970s, Bernie became known as a pioneer in electronic trading. While most stock trading still happened on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, Bernie was among the first to use computers to match buyers and sellers. He helped develop NASDAQ, the electronic stock exchange that would eventually rival the New York Stock Exchange. This innovation made him wealthy and respected in the financial industry. By the 1980s, Bernie Madoff was a major figure on Wall Street. His firm was one of the top market makers, handling a significant percentage of all stock trades in certain securities. Bernie served as chairman of NASDAQ in 1990, 1991, and 1993. He sat on committees, advised regulators, and was widely viewed as one of the elder statesmen of the financial industry. Bernie and Ruth lived well. They had a luxurious penthouse in Manhattan, a beach house in the Hamptons, a mansion in Palm Beach, and homes in France. They traveled extensively, belonged to exclusive clubs, and moved in wealthy social circles. They had two sons, Mark and Andrew, who both eventually joined the family business. But beneath this success, something dark was growing. At some point, possibly as early as the 1960s, though the exact timing remains unclear, Bernie started running a Ponzi scheme. The Ponzi scheme explained. To understand Bernie Madoff's crime, you need to understand what a Ponzi scheme is. It's named after Charles Ponzi, who ran a famous scheme in the 1920s. Here's how it works. You promise investors high returns on their money. Let's say you promise 10% annual returns. Investors give you their money, trusting you to invest it wisely, but you don't actually invest the money. Instead, you just keep it. When investors want to withdraw their money or collect their returns, you pay them using money from new investors. As long as new money keeps coming in, you can keep paying the earlier investors. They see consistent returns, they trust you, they tell their friends, and more people invest. The scheme grows. But it's mathematically impossible to sustain forever. Eventually, you reach a point where you can't find enough new investors to pay the earlier ones, or something happens that causes many people to withdraw their money at once. When that happens, the scheme collapses. There's no actual investment, no real money, just an elaborate shell game where money from new victims pays earlier victims. This is what Bernie Madoff did, but on an unprecedented scale and for an incredibly long time. Bernie's legitimate market-making business was on the 19th floor of his New York office building. This business was real, profitable, and legal. But on the 17th floor, Bernie ran his investment advisory business. This is where the fraud happened. The 17th floor was off-limits to most employees. Bernie controlled access carefully. Only a small group of people worked there, and they were extremely loyal to Bernie. He paid them well and demanded absolute secrecy about what happened on that floor. Clients who invested with Bernie's advisory business believed their money was being invested in stocks and options using a sophisticated strategy called split strike conversion. This strategy supposedly generated steady returns of 10 to 12% annually, regardless of market conditions. These returns weren't spectacular, not so high that they seemed too good to be true, but they were consistent. Year after year, Bernie's clients saw steady profits. But Bernie wasn't actually executing this strategy. He wasn't buying stocks or options. The money coming in from new investors went into a bank account at JP Chase. When investors wanted to withdraw money or collect returns, Bernie simply transferred money from this account. He created fake account statements showing trades that never happened and profits that didn't exist. Bernie employed a small team on the 17th floor whose job was to create these fake statements. They had computer programs that would generate realistic-looking trade confirmations and account statements. These documents showed a sophisticated investment strategy producing consistent returns, but it was all fiction. The trades listed on the statements had never actually occurred. The red flags everyone ignored. Looking back, there were many signs that something was wrong with Bernie Madoff's investment business. The question is, why didn't anyone catch it earlier? First, the returns were suspiciously consistent. In real investing, returns fluctuate. Good years, bad years, mediocre years. That's normal. But Bernie's clients saw steady returns of 10 to 12% year after year, regardless of what was happening in the broader market. When the stock market crashed, Bernie's clients still made money. When the market boomed, Bernie's returns stayed the same. This consistency was essentially impossible with legitimate investing. Second, Bernie's strategy didn't make sense to experts who examined it. The split-strike conversion strategy he claimed to use would require buying and selling huge volumes of options, but market data showed these trades weren't happening. The options market simply wasn't large enough to accommodate the volume of trading Bernie claimed to be doing. Third, Bernie's accounting firm was tiny. For a company managing billions of dollars, you would expect auditing by a major accounting firm, one of the big four firms with resources and expertise. Instead, Bernie used a three-person accounting firm operating out of a small office in a strip mall. This firm had neither the expertise nor the capacity to properly audit a multi-billion-dollar investment operation. Fourth, Bernie was extremely secretive about his investment process. He didn't want outside scrutiny. He turned away potential investors who asked too many questions. He insisted that his strategy was proprietary and couldn't be shared. Legitimate money managers welcome scrutiny because they have nothing to hide. Bernie's secrecy should have been a massive red flag. Fifth, several financial analysts and investigators explicitly warned that Bernie was running a fraud. Harry Markopolos, a financial analyst, investigated Bernie's returns and concluded they were mathematically impossible. In 2000, Markopolos submitted a report to the SEC titled "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." He provided detailed evidence and calculations showing that Bernie's returns couldn't be real. But the SEC didn't act on Markopolos' warnings. They investigated Bernie multiple times between 1992 and 2008, but never uncovered the fraud. Why? Several reasons. Bernie was a respected Wall Street figure who had helped create NASDAQ. SEC investigators were intimidated by his status. Bernie was also charming and convincing when questioned. He would explain away concerns, provide documentation, fake but convincing, and assure investigators everything was legitimate. The SEC investigators, many of whom were young and inexperienced, accepted his explanations. Additionally, there may have been a cultural bias at work. Bernie was Jewish and operated largely within Jewish social and philanthropic circles. Some investigators may have hesitated to pursue an aggressive investigation for fear of appearing anti-Semitic. Bernie used his connections in the Jewish community as both a shield and a hunting ground. So, despite multiple red flags and explicit warnings, Bernie continued operating his fraud for decades. People wanted to believe. Investors were making money, or thought they were. Regulators were fooled by Bernie's reputation, and Bernie was skilled at maintaining the illusion. How Bernie recruited victims. Bernie Madoff didn't advertise for clients. In fact, he often turned people away, creating an aura of exclusivity. This was part of his strategy. People always want what they can't easily have. Bernie primarily recruited through social and philanthropic networks. He was active in Jewish charities and social organizations. He sat on boards, attended fundraisers, and donated generously to causes. This positioned him as a successful, generous community member, someone trustworthy. Wealthy individuals in these circles would hear about Bernie's investment fund. They would learn that he generated consistent returns. They would ask if they could invest. Bernie would sometimes say no, or he would say he'd think about it. This made people want in even more. Once someone invested with Bernie, they usually stayed invested for life. They saw steady returns. They received professional-looking statements. Everything seemed perfect. And they told their friends. This word-of-mouth recruitment was powerful. If your friend or family member is making 10–12% annually with Bernie Madoff, you want in too, especially when the friend is someone you trust, your brother, your golf partner, your fellow board member at the charity. Bernie also recruited feeder funds, investment managers who would pool money from their clients and invest it all with Bernie. These feeder funds earned fees from their clients and kickbacks from Bernie. They did little actual work. They just collected money and sent it to Bernie. Several feeder fund managers became very wealthy this way, and when the fraud collapsed, they faced serious legal consequences for not doing proper due diligence. Some victims were celebrities and wealthy individuals: Steven Spielberg, Kevin Bacon, Kyra Sedgwick, Sandy Koufax, and many others. But Bernie also destroyed smaller investors, retirees who had invested their life savings, people who thought they were set for a comfortable retirement. Bernie particularly targeted Jewish charities and foundations. Organizations like the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization, and many others lost millions. These were organizations doing good work, and Bernie destroyed them while pretending to be one of their biggest supporters. The 2008 collapse. Bernie Madoff's scheme could only continue as long as new money kept flowing in. For decades, this wasn't a problem. Bernie's reputation attracted investors, and he was able to pay existing clients with money from new clients. But in 2008, the global financial crisis changed everything. The stock market crashed, real estate prices collapsed, banks failed, investors everywhere were panicking and pulling money out of investments to cover losses elsewhere or simply to have cash on hand. Bernie's clients were no exception. Throughout 2008, redemption requests increased. People wanted their money back. In a legitimate investment fund, this would be fine. You sell some stocks, collect the cash, and pay the clients. But Bernie had no stocks to sell. He had no investments. He just had a bank account, and the money in that account was running out. Bernie tried to keep the scheme going. He called friends and contacts, trying to raise new money. He became increasingly desperate. But in the midst of a global financial crisis, finding wealthy people willing to invest was nearly impossible. Everyone was scared and holding on to their cash. By December 2008, Bernie knew it was over. He couldn't raise enough new money to cover the redemption requests. The scheme was going to collapse. He had to make a decision: disappear and run, or confess. On December 10, 2008, Bernie called his sons Mark and Andrew to his apartment. He told them the truth. The investment advisory business was a fraud. It was all a lie. He had been running a Ponzi scheme for years. The money was gone. Mark and Andrew were shocked and devastated. They had worked for their father's company, but in the legitimate market-making business on the 19th floor. They insisted they had no knowledge of the fraud happening on the 17th floor, and investigators would later confirm this. But they were still Bernie's sons, and the revelation destroyed them. The next day, Mark called his lawyer. The lawyer contacted federal prosecutors. On December 11, 2008, FBI agents arrived at Bernie's apartment at 7 a.m. When Bernie answered the door, he knew why they were there. "We're here to find out if there's an innocent explanation," one agent said. Bernie paused, then said, "There is no innocent explanation." He confessed immediately. He admitted running a Ponzi scheme. He said he was finished, that he had absolutely nothing, and that it's all just one big lie. He estimated that the losses could be as much as $50 billion. Bernie was arrested and charged with securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, false statements, perjury, and false filings with the SEC. He was initially released on $10 million bail, confined to his penthouse apartment with electronic monitoring. The aftermath and trial. As news of Bernie's arrest spread, shockwaves rippled through the financial world. Bernie Madoff, the respected Wall Street legend, was a fraud. Everything had been a lie. Victims began to understand what had happened. That money they thought they had? Gone. Those steady returns they'd been seeing? Never real. Those account statements showing millions in investments? Complete fiction. The human toll was devastating. Retirees who thought they were financially secure discovered they had nothing. People who had planned to donate to charities couldn't. Foundations shut down. Lives were destroyed. Some victims committed suicide. Thierry Magon de la Villehuche, a French aristocrat and money manager who had invested with Bernie, killed himself in his New York office. William Foxton, a British former soldier who lost his life savings, took his own life. Mark Madoff, Bernie's own son, hanged himself exactly 2 years after his father's arrest, unable to cope with the shame and the constant accusations that he must have known about the fraud. Bernie initially planned to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. On March 12, 2009, he pleaded guilty to all 11 federal felonies. He admitted to running a Ponzi scheme and defrauding thousands of clients over decades. At his sentencing hearing on June 29, 2009, victims were allowed to speak. One after another, they described how Bernie had destroyed their lives. They called him evil, a monster, a sociopath. They demanded the maximum sentence. Bernie made a brief statement. "I am responsible for a great deal of suffering and pain. I understand that. I live in a tormented state now, knowing all the pain and suffering I have created. I have left a legacy of shame, as some of my victims have pointed out, to my family and my grandchildren. This is something I will live with for the rest of my life. I'm sorry." Many victims found his apology hollow and insincere. It was too little, too late. Judge Denny Chin sentenced Bernie to the maximum, 150 years in federal prison. Bernie was 71 years old. He would die in prison, and everyone knew it. The judge said Bernie's crimes were extraordinarily evil and that the sentence should send a message. Life in prison. Bernie Madoff was sent to the Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina, a medium-security prison. In many ways, prison was easier for Bernie than for many inmates. He was old, white-collar, non-violent. He wasn't targeted by other prisoners for violence. But prison was still prison. Bernie lost his freedom, his wealth, his reputation, and most of his family relationships. His wife Ruth stopped visiting him after a few years. His son Mark had committed suicide. His son Andrew wanted nothing to do with him and later died of cancer in 2014. Bernie was alone with the consequences of his choices. In prison interviews, Bernie showed little genuine remorse. He seemed more concerned with how he was perceived than with the suffering he caused. He complained about his treatment, insisted that sophisticated investors should have known his returns weren't real, and suggested that his victims bore some responsibility for their losses because they were greedy. This attitude revealed Bernie's fundamental narcissism and lack of empathy. He couldn't truly understand that he had destroyed lives. He could only see things from his own perspective, and in his mind, he was the victim, caught, imprisoned, abandoned by his family. Bernie also gave several prison interviews where he claimed he started the Ponzi scheme in the early 1990s during a recession, but investigators believe the fraud started much earlier, possibly in the 1960s or 1970s. Bernie was lying even about when he started lying. The final accounting. Determining exactly how much money Bernie Madoff stole is complicated. The fake account statements showed about $65 billion in client accounts, but this number was fiction. It included decades of fake returns that never existed. The actual amount that clients invested with Bernie, the real money that went into the scheme, was approximately $20 billion. But even this number is complicated because some early investors did withdraw money paid with later investors' funds. After accounting for withdrawals, the actual losses to clients were calculated at about $17.5 billion. Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee responsible for recovering funds for victims, has worked for over a decade to claw back money. He sued feeder funds, early investors who withdrew more than they invested, banks that should have detected the fraud, and anyone else who profited from Bernie's scheme. As of 2021, Picard had recovered about $14.4 billion, a remarkable achievement that exceeded most expectations. Many victims received significant portions of their lost principal back, though they lost all the fictional returns they thought they had earned. But money can't undo the psychological and emotional damage. Many victims never recovered from the betrayal and financial devastation. Families were torn apart. Trust was destroyed. Some people never felt financially secure again even after receiving recovered funds. Ruth Madoff, victim or accomplice? One of the most controversial figures in the Madoff case is Bernie's wife, Ruth. Did she know about the fraud? Was she a willing accomplice, a victim, or willfully ignorant? Ruth has always maintained she had no knowledge of Bernie's Ponzi scheme. She says she was completely shocked when Bernie confessed. Investigators found no evidence that Ruth was directly involved in the fraud, and she was never charged with any crimes. However, many victims don't believe her. They point out that Ruth worked for Bernie's company for years, handling some accounting. She would have seen money flowing through accounts. How could she not notice something was wrong? Ruth also benefited enormously from Bernie's fraud. She lived in luxury, wore expensive jewelry, traveled constantly, belonged to exclusive clubs. All of this was paid for with stolen money. Even if she didn't know the specific details of the fraud, she must have known something was off. After Bernie's arrest, Ruth agreed to forfeit $80 million in assets, keeping only $2.5 million. She left her penthouse and moved to a modest condo in Connecticut. She was shunned by most of her former friends and social circles. Her sons both died, Mark by suicide, Andrew from cancer, and she blamed Bernie for both deaths. Ruth has lived in relative obscurity since the scandal. She occasionally gives interviews where she insists she was deceived like everyone else. Whether you believe her depends partly on what you think willful blindness means. Did Ruth actively participate in fraud? Probably not. Did she choose to not ask questions when she should have? Quite possibly. Is there a moral difference? That's for each person to decide. The enablers and the failures. Bernie Madoff didn't operate in a vacuum. Many people and institutions enabled his fraud, either through active participation or negligent oversight. The feeder funds that channeled billions to Bernie without doing proper due diligence were complicit. They earned fees and kickbacks while directing their clients into a fraud. Several feeder fund managers faced criminal charges or civil lawsuits. J.P. Morgan Chase, where Bernie kept the bank account he used for the Ponzi scheme, settled for $2.6 billion for failing to report suspicious activity. Bank employees had noticed unusual patterns but didn't act on them. The SEC failed repeatedly to detect the fraud, despite multiple investigations and explicit warnings from Harry Markopolos and others. The SEC's failures were so egregious that they sparked calls for regulatory reform. Accounting firms that audited feeder funds without properly verifying that Bernie's investments were real were negligent. Some faced lawsuits and reputational damage. Individual investors who withdrew more from Bernie than they invested, profiting from the fraud at the expense of later victims, were sued by the trustee. This was controversial. These investors thought they were earning legitimate returns, but legally they had received stolen money that belonged to other victims. The broader lesson is that financial fraud on this scale requires systemic failures. Bernie was the architect and primary criminal, but many others failed in their duties to prevent, detect, or stop the fraud. Lessons from the Madoff scandal. What can we learn from Bernie Madoff's massive fraud? First, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Consistent high returns with low risk don't exist in legitimate investing. The market has good years and bad years. Anyone promising steady double-digit returns regardless of market conditions is either lying or taking risks they're not disclosing. Second, past performance doesn't guarantee future results or prove legitimacy. Bernie had been in business for 50 years. He was chairman of NASDAQ. He had an impeccable reputation. None of that made his fraud less fraudulent. You can't rely on reputation alone. Third, demand transparency. If an investment manager won't clearly explain their strategy, won't let you verify trades, won't provide detailed accounting, walk away. Secrecy in financial management is a red flag. Fourth, bigger isn't always safer. Bernie managed billions of dollars. Major institutions invested with him. None of that protected investors when the fraud collapsed. In fact, the large scale made people less suspicious. Surely something this big with so many sophisticated investors must be legitimate. Fifth, regulators can fail. The SEC investigated Bernie multiple times and missed the fraud every time. You can't assume that regulatory oversight means something is safe. Do your own due diligence. Sixth, be wary of exclusive opportunities. Bernie created an aura of exclusivity. You had to be special to invest with him. This made people feel privileged to be accepted as clients and less likely to ask hard questions. But exclusivity and legitimacy are different things. Finally, understand that anyone can be a victim of fraud. Bernie's clients included sophisticated investors, major institutions, smart business people, and financial professionals. No one is immune to a sufficiently well-crafted fraud. The key is to stay skeptical, ask questions, and verify everything. The cultural impact. The Bernie Madoff scandal became a cultural phenomenon. It spawned books, documentaries, films, and endless analysis. Bernie became the face of Wall Street greed and criminality. The scandal broke during the 2008 financial crisis, when public anger at Wall Street was already high. Bernie became a symbol of everything people hated about the financial industry: the greed, the dishonesty, the destruction of ordinary people's lives for personal gain. The phrase Ponzi scheme entered common vocabulary. Before Madoff, most people hadn't heard the term. After Madoff, everyone knew what it meant. Bernie's name became synonymous with financial fraud. The scandal also sparked debates about wealth, privilege, and justice. Bernie got 150 years in prison, but many people involved in the 2008 financial crisis, people who destroyed the economy and cost millions of jobs, faced no criminal charges at all. Was this fair? Why was Bernie punished so harshly while others escaped consequences? Some argued that Bernie was made an example because he stole from the wealthy and powerful. His victims included celebrities, major charities, and wealthy individuals who had connections and could demand justice. In contrast, the 2008 crisis primarily hurt ordinary people who lacked the power to demand accountability. The Madoff case also raised questions about affinity fraud, targeting members of your own community. Bernie used his position in the Jewish community to recruit victims, exploiting trust and shared identity. This made his betrayal feel even more personal to many victims. Bernie's death. On April 14, 2021, Bernie Madoff died in federal prison at age 82. He had been suffering from end-stage renal disease and other health problems. He died alone, estranged from most of his family, his reputation destroyed, his legacy one of shame and devastation. News of his death generated mixed reactions. Some victims felt relief that he was finally gone. Others felt cheated that he had died relatively peacefully of natural causes rather than serving his full sentence. Some felt nothing. The damage was done, and whether Bernie was alive or dead didn't change what had happened to them. Ruth Madoff did not publicly comment on her husband's death. By that point, she had long since cut herself off from Bernie and tried to rebuild what was left of her life. Bernie's death closed the final chapter on one of the most notorious financial crimes in history, but the effects of his fraud continue. Victims still deal with the financial and psychological consequences. The case still serves as a cautionary tale in business schools and financial training programs, and Bernie's name remains synonymous with fraud and betrayal. Remembering the victims. In telling Bernie Madoff's story, we must remember that he wasn't the only one affected. His fraud destroyed thousands of lives. Retirees who lost everything and had to go back to work in their 70s and 80s. Charities that had to shut down, ending their missions and laying off dedicated employees. Families torn apart by financial devastation and the stress it created. People who took their own lives because they couldn't cope with the losses. The children and grandchildren of victims who lost inheritances and opportunities. Small business owners who invested their life savings and lost everything. These people trusted Bernie. They believed he was investing their money wisely. They thought they were being smart, prudent, careful, and they were destroyed by his lies. Every time we talk about Bernie Madoff, we should remember that behind the big number, $65 billion, $17.5 billion in actual losses, are thousands of individual tragedies. People who worked their entire lives, saved carefully, made what they thought were smart decisions, and lost everything because one man decided his greed mattered more than their well-being. Final thoughts. Bernie Madoff ran the largest Ponzi scheme in history, but he wasn't that special. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't even particularly creative. Ponzi schemes have existed for over a century. What made Bernie different was the scale, the duration, and the brazenness of his fraud. Bernie succeeded because people wanted to believe. His victims wanted steady returns. Regulators wanted to trust a Wall Street legend. Feeder funds wanted easy fees. Banks wanted a profitable client. Everyone had an incentive to believe Bernie was legitimate, so they didn't ask hard questions. Bernie also succeeded because he understood psychology. He created an aura of exclusivity and trustworthiness. He targeted people through social and philanthropic networks where trust was high. He generated returns that were good, but not so spectacular they seemed impossible. He maintained the fraud for so long that people stopped questioning it. Surely something that had worked for 20, 30, 40 years must be real. But it was all a lie. Every account statement was fiction. Every return was fake. Every dollar paid out to early investors was stolen from later investors. For decades, Bernie maintained this massive lie, living in luxury, enjoying the respect and admiration of the financial world, while knowing that everything was built on fraud. When the scheme finally collapsed, Bernie seemed more annoyed than remorseful. He complained about being betrayed by clients who withdrew their money. He suggested sophisticated investors should have known something was wrong. He acted as if he was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of a massive fraud. This reveals Bernie's fundamental character. He was a narcissist who believed the rules didn't apply to him. He lacked empathy. He could charm people and understand what they wanted to hear, but he couldn't genuinely care about the harm he caused. He was, in the end, a sociopath in an expensive suit. Bernie Madoff died in prison, his reputation destroyed, his family devastated, his wealth gone. This was justice of a sort, but it doesn't undo the harm. It doesn't bring back Mark Madoff or the other victims who committed suicide. It doesn't restore the charities that shut down or the retirements that were destroyed. The lesson of Bernie Madoff isn't just about financial fraud. It's about trust, about greed, about the willingness to believe what we want to believe, and about the terrible damage that one person can do when they prioritize their own wealth and ego over thousands of other people's well-being. Bernie Madoff was not a mastermind. He was a con artist who got away with his con for far too long. The real question isn't how Bernie fooled everyone. It's why so many smart people wanted to be fooled, why they ignored the red flags, why they chose comfort over caution. That's a question worth thinking about, because the next Bernie Madoff is probably out there right now running a fraud that seems too legitimate to question. And the only way to avoid being his victim is to remember Bernie's story and maintain the skepticism that his victims lacked. Another dark chapter closed, but the mystery of human nature continues. Thanks for listening to True Crime Stories for English Learners. Don't forget to subscribe
and join me next time for another real story that's stranger than fiction.